This is a two-part series on how to harden and secure your WordPress website. The first part, which is this video, we're going to look at some plugins as well as some built-in features within WordPress to harden the WordPress website. The second part, in the next video, we'll take it a step further where we'll explore looking at your hosts as well as going into some code to harden the WordPress website. So the first thing we want to do is we want to go to users, and we want to look at users to see what kind of users you have. Any users that don't need access to the WordPress website, we can start deleting those users. And for the users that do have access, we want to make sure that they have the correct role. And you can Google what the different access levels are in terms of those roles. As right now, there's only one user for this website. So the next thing we want to do is we want to enforce and ensure that all users have a strong password. And as of right now, within WordPress 4.9.1, they have a generation password feature with a they automatically generate strong passwords for you, and I highly recommend using the passwords that they've auto-generated for you. They're going to be pretty difficult to hack. At the same time, they're going to be pretty difficult to remember. So I recommend a password management software like LastPass to keep track of these types of users and user passwords. So that covers users. You want to just make sure that any users who no longer needs access to the WordPress website to be deleted, and any users that are left over, make sure that they use strong passwords as well as setting up the correct roles for those users. You want to give them the highest access as possible, or the lowest access as possible to each user. You don't want them to be all set up as admin if they don't need to be admin. The next thing we want to go through is we want to click on plugins and take a look at all the plugins that are installed on your WordPress website. Any plugins that don't need to be in WordPress should not be in WordPress. So this might take some trial and error in terms of deactivating plugs to see which ones are really necessary versus which ones don't. You probably want to back up your website and do this on a development or staging server in case any deactivations does break any plugins, and reactivation does not necessarily sometimes when you deactivate some of these third-party plugins and you reactivate them, they don't work. So definitely want to do this on staging or development. So in this example, I'm just going to deactivate all these plugins except for Backup Buddy, which we'll go over shortly, because I know that these plugins aren't going to be used on the site. And the next thing you want to do is, even with deactivation, you probably just want to delete them completely, even though they're not going to be activated on the site. So I'm going to go ahead and delete these plugins, because plugins open up security holes, and you don't want to open yourself with any potential security holes if you don't need to. You just want to keep the plugins that you use, and that way you eliminate any backdoors that could occur because of the third-party plugins. So now we're down to just one plugin that we know we absolutely need, and that will eliminate a lot of the threats. So the next thing I want to do, which is similar with plugins, is with themes. So any extra themes that we don't need, we want to eliminate as well. So you can kind of see the recurring pattern with themes, users, and plugins. Anything that we don't need, we are going to delete. So now we're just with one theme, the 2017, which is the theme that we are currently using. Now, currently this website is up to date with everything. But if it isn't, we want to go to dashboard and update, and we want to update anything that needs to be updated, and that includes the core WordPress as well as plugins and themes. But as of right now, everything's up to date, so we're set on that. But if it's not, which you'll have like a little indicator, a little I think orange or red circle with the number of plugins, themes, and then the WordPress core itself, it would be a number of how many items that needs to be updated. So you want to go into dashboard, update, and go through here and update everything. Again, doing this on staging and development will kind of give you the peace of mind that if something breaks because of incompatibility, at least it's not affecting your production site. So you want to do everything on staging and development, and once it's all set, migrate all the changes over to production. Now, going through the mindset of having everything up to date, I personally like having everything up to date on day 0 and have it automated, so that way I'm not going in weekly or daily to see if something needs to be updated. Now, there is a risk with that in terms of having things automated, in that if something gets updated and something breaks, that's going to happen on your production site. So, you have to weigh the balance. Is it worth the risk of having something automated and breaking versus doing it daily and weekly on staging to see if it breaks and then do the changes on production? It just depends on how big the site is. For most of the users watching this video, it's probably going to be fine auto updating, because it's easier to fix something that's incompatible than to get a black eye in that a vulnerability that occurs in the wild will essentially hack your website on that day. So let's go ahead, and one of the plugins that I like to use in terms of auto updating is a plugin that I think it's called Automatic Plugin Update, which will automatically update all the plugins when a plugin update is available. Now, as for the WordPress core, that's going to be in part 2, where we can set a configuration, but that requires some coding. So this is the one, Automatic Plugin Updates. So this one will automatically update the plugins on when it's available. So that will prevent any types of hacking that could occur for any vulnerability that could show itself in any of your plugins that you have installed. So again, outweigh the balance of setting something that's automated versus going in manually on a routine basis to see and if a plugin needs to be updated, and then doing it manually. The next plugin I want to go over that I like to have on my site is the AntiMalware plugin. And this one's great. It is manual, unless there is a automatic feature with the Pro version. But what this does is essentially, it's like a antivirus scanner that you run on your desktop, but this one's for WordPress. So you install it, and then you can run a complete scan, and essentially it'll basically scan your WordPress website and look to see if there's any malware that's installed on the site, or any malware code that's been injected into the WordPress files. And then we'll run this. I'll pause the video, run this, and wait until it's finished, and then we can see if there's any threats that needs to be eliminated. As of right now, there's some potential threats. It will have some false positives, but we'll walk through that when this finishes running. Now that it finished scanning, we can see that we don't have any threats, just a couple potential threats, and we could look at each one and see if it's a false positive or not. All of these are false positive. Once you run this a couple of times, you'll know if you get a threat. Not only will it not show up in the potential threats, but actually under threats. But let's say it is a potential threat and you look at the code, it'll typically will be quite obvious that something needs to be cleaned up, because you'll see like a bunch of gibberish, weird characters, as well as weird coding that will kind of be a red flag that yes, this is a threat and this needs to be cleaned. And by cleaning, here it's saying that, oh, this is the part where it thinks the threat is, which is not really a threat. It's probably raising a red flag just because it's using the eval. A lot of the threats will use eval as a piece of code that will essentially cause havoc in terms of your website, because eval essentially will run any type of executable code. But in this case, this is fine. So I'm going to leave it as that, and you guys can explore a little bit further in terms of if something's a threat or not, in terms of just looking at the code. You might need a developer to analyze, oh, is this a threat or not? If it's a false positive, just like under the potential threats. The next thing I want to go over is Backup Buddy. Now, I have a plugin that's installed currently on this website, and it's called Backup Buddy. Every website should have some sort of backup mechanism. If it's not already provided by a hosting, a lot of hostings do provide backups. I personally like Backup Buddy because I can then control when my website gets backed up, how often, and it is nice to essentially have it automated in a way that I want it automated. So I can have it backed up, and then I can choose the remote destination of where the actual backup files are going to be stored. And Backup Buddy does allow different places to back up. I don't like having my backups be backed up on the same server as where my website is located, because if the server gets compromised and the website gets compromised, well, the website gets compromised and then causes the server to be compromised, I don't know if my backups are going to be compromised or not. So I like to have it backed up in somewhere else, either in Dropbox, email, most likely not, just because the backups for WordPress are large. FTP on another server is definitely a good option, or Amazon S3. Backup Buddy does have Backup Buddy Stash, which is their own servers to house backups. And then you can go under Schedules to then set up the intervals of how often something gets backed up or not. Backup Buddy is nice because it is easy to restore. I'll create a video on how to restore a website using Backup Buddy. Now, the thing with Backup Buddy is that it is a premium plugin, so it's not free. It's offered by a company called iThemes. So, take a look at that and see if it makes sense to, purchase Backup Buddy. I personally like it. I love it. So, take a look at that. Because with Backup Buddy, what's nice is that it will back up a website as a zip file, and you could easily restore it by either restoring the whole website or restore specific components of the website, so like specific files, specific media like pictures and videos and audio files, or you could just also restore just the database. So lots of options. It's definitely a solid plugin, but regardless, your website, you should have some sort of backup mechanism so that if your website gets hacked, you can easily restore the website. So that's backups. Now, the next plugin I like to install on my WordPress websites is a plugin called Block Bad Queries, so BBQ. So BBQ, block bad queries. And what this does is that this plugin will prevent spam bots from hacking website through the query. So a way to hack into WordPress is by injecting a malicious code via the URL, and to see if a WordPress will be, if there's a vulnerability within a plugin where they're not parameterizing their queries correctly, could essentially be hacked through, putting injectable code in here that will then get executed. So block bad queries will prevent that. It also will prevent just queries in general that don't seem to be coming from a human and is being automated by a bot. So by automatically blocking those queries, it could make your website more efficient because it's not processing all these bad queries that are generated by bots. Along the same lines of BBQ is another plugin called Bad Behavior. So I like to install both. So Bad Behavior right here is another good plugin that, along the same lines as BBQ, prevents bots from spamming your website through the query, as well as trying to hack your websites through putting code in your query. So the next type of plugin that I want to introduce is a CAPTCHA plugin. So CAPTCHA is a way for software to determine if a form, either a login or just like a contact form being submitted, is actually being submitted by a person and not a spam bot. And it does this by verifying either a bunch of characters where it's going to be a little bit messed up, but not completely messed up, that you as a person that you can't kind of decipher it and essentially put it into the text box. Another type is essentially using math, which is the type of plugin that I'll introduce in this video. Let's go ahead and add the math CAPTCHA. Let's go ahead and install. And then activate. And then go to settings and click on login form, and everything else looks good. And then I'm going to log out so that you can see the math CAPTCHA in action. So now when I log in, I have to do some math before I can log in, and this will prevent bots from randomly putting characters in the username and password. It'll have to then figure out the math problem, and sometimes it's not as easy as these numbers. I mean, the mathematics can change. It could be plus, minus, division, but it can also be words as well. Instead of having 84 as a numeric number, it could be in characters, 84. So now I'm logged in. It already did the math. It is a pain in the butt, but it is worth it for security. Let's go back to the math CAPTCHA, and I can show you. There's different mathematical operations. I just leave it as the default. Let's add the words in, because that does add a little bit more security. So the last piece of plugin that I want to introduce is an actual security plugin that will harden the WordPress software through a couple of things, and the one I like is the iTheme Security. And then let's go through some of the more popular security settings that I typically use when I use iTheme Security. So go to Security and then Settings. First off the check, I'll typically will just do the secure site, which will enable some of the basic features. And then I typically just go ahead and activate the network brute force protection. And then let's close this, and then let's go through some of the popular features that I typically will use. The away mode, I typically don't use that, but it does offer a nice added security. And what this does is essentially only allow you to even be able to access the login page during a certain duration of time. So if you know you're not going to access your WordPress website from like 2 o'clock in the morning to like 5 o'clock in the morning, then you can basically have the away time or away mode activated during those periods of time, so that you can't log in during those period of times. Of course, the time is basically the server time and not exactly the time that you are in. So make sure that you know what the time on the server is. In this case, here it's saying it's December 30th, 2017 at 6:55, which is not my time. My time is 12 hours different. So just make sure you do the math and set the the time according to the adjustment of the server. That way you're not locking yourself out during times that you do access. But the reason why I don't typically use the away mode is because of an advanced feature where I can totally hide the default login to somewhere else. And I'll go through that shortly. SSL is important, but we'll do that in part 2 because it will require some server configurations as well as looking at your host. But I like to essentially reset the salt string, so I'm going to go ahead and do that, and it'll log me out. So the salts are essentially the initial seed, which is basically a starting point where passwords and sessions get generated from. So resetting them is a good idea. So I'm going to go ahead and reset the salt strings. And now I'm logged out, so I'll have to re-log in. Now that I'm logged in and back into the iThemes security settings, let's go to advanced, because this is where the most important stuff is going to happen. So I definitely do admin user, and essentially I'll click on that, and essentially it'll make it so that the user ID 1 is completely removed, and it logs me out again. Most likely because there's only one user, and that user is ID 1, and that was essentially the user that I'm using. So let's go back to advanced. I typically like to do the change database table prefixes. Go ahead and click on yes. And essentially what this is that your data within WordPress are stored in a database under specific table names. And to make it a little bit harder for people to hack into your database, for example, like WP underscore option, which stores all your options, instead of making that as a default for all your WordPress websites, WordPress has introduced a prefix where it'll be harder to guess what that table name is, because it's not WP underscore options, but maybe WP underscore, and in this case it's going to be 081 underscore options. And this part is just randomly generated. So I'm going to go ahead and click on save. And here it's just changed to, I guess, yeah, W underscore 081 was what it was before. Now it's changed to this, which is going to be a lot harder to guess. And then this one, the hide backend, I think it's one of the most important features. So I'm going to go ahead and click on enable the hide backend feature, and let's just use something like secret backdoor 123 as the login page. So let's go ahead and click on save settings, and let's go ahead and log out. Let's go back to the home page just to kind of reset everything. So let's try this out. We're from the home page, and typically the default login is going to be like wp-admin or wp-login. Let's try that as well. wp-login. And as you can see, the default is no longer there. You can no longer use the default. It's actually hidden. But if we do our slug that we put in, which is, let's see, which is secret backdoor 123, we can see that we access the login page again. Plus, with the added math captcha, should definitely give you some really good security in terms of the login page. So that essentially covers all the part one of the WP security and hardening that I typically use. That just requires just installing plugins as well as configuring them. The next series, in part two, we'll go over and take it a little bit step further, which will require some code changes and some server configurations to really take it to the next level and essentially lock down your WordPress site like Fort Knox. But it will be a little bit more advanced, so you may need a developer to execute some of these part 2 changes, but it'll be introduced in the next video. Thanks.